The blue lights flashed in the rearview mirror at 8:47 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday in Riverside Heights, and Malcolm Rivers, CEO of Rivers Tech Solutions, pulled his midnight black Mercedes S-Class to the side of Oak Boulevard. Hands already on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 because that's what you do when you're a successful black man driving through an affluent neighborhood, even when it's your own neighborhood, even when you've done nothing wrong. Even when you know the script by heart because you've lived it before, the initial politeness that curdles into suspicion, the reasonable questions that become accusations, the traffic stop that becomes an interrogation about how you can afford this car, this watch, this life. Officer Derek Hutchins approached the driver's window with his hand resting on his service weapon, his partner, Officer Jamie Torres, hanging back by the patrol car, and before Malcolm could even speak, before he could produce his license and registration, before he could ask what violation prompted this stop, Officer Hutchins shone his flashlight directly into Malcolm's face and said with that particular tone that somehow manages to be both polite and threatening, "Sir, we received reports of a suspicious vehicle matching this description in the area. We've had several break-ins recently, and I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Suspicious vehicle, code words. Dog whistles, the language of racial profiling dressed up in the syntax of public safety. Because Malcolm's Mercedes wasn't suspicious when the white executive 3 houses down drove an identical model, wasn't suspicious when his neighbor's son borrowed it last week, became suspicious only when the person behind the wheel had melanin, had the audacity to own something valuable, had the nerve to exist in a space that someone had decided wasn't meant for him. Malcolm took a breath. The kind of breath that holds back a decade of these exact moments, a lifetime of being questioned in spaces he'd earned the right to occupy, and responded with the careful precision of someone who knows that tone, attitude, and even facial expressions can be weaponized against black men in encounters with police. "Officer, I live here. This is my neighborhood. I was just coming home from my office. Is there a specific traffic violation I committed?" But Officer Hutchins wasn't interested in violations, wasn't interested in logic. He was interested in compliance, in asserting dominance, in reminding Malcolm that badges and guns trump business cards and bank accounts, and he repeated louder, more aggressive, hand moving from resting on his weapon to actually gripping it. "I said step out of the vehicle. I'm not going to ask again." The threat was explicit now, the implication clear. Comply or face escalation, face potential violence, face the reality that this traffic stop could become a statistic, a hashtag, a mother crying on the news asking why her son didn't come home. And Malcolm knew this, felt this, understood with crystal clarity that he was one wrong move, one perceived threat, one officer's fear or anger away from tragedy. So he complied, slowly opening his door, keeping his hands visible, moving with deliberate care, performing the choreography of survival that every black parent teaches their children, the dance of de-escalation that shouldn't be necessary but absolutely is. As Malcolm stood beside his car, Officer Hutchins began the familiar ritual of interrogation disguised as investigation. "Whose car is this? Where are you coming from? Do you have any weapons? Any drugs? Can I search your vehicle?" Questions that had nothing to do with the alleged suspicious vehicle report. Questions designed to find something, anything to justify the stop, to validate the profiling, to prove that the suspicion was warranted, even when it wasn't. And Malcolm, standing there in his tailored Hugo Boss suit, his Rolex catching the streetlight, his briefcase full of contracts and quarterly reports visible in the back seat, answered each question with patience he didn't feel. "This is my car. I'm coming from my office downtown. I'm the CEO of Rivers Tech Solutions. I have no weapons, no drugs, and no, you may not search my vehicle without probable cause." The mention of probable cause seemed to irritate Officer Hutchins, as if Malcolm knowing his rights was somehow suspicious in itself, as if educated articulation from a black man was a threat rather than a constitutional exercise. And he responded with that classic deflection. "If you have nothing to hide, why not just let me search? Only people with something to hide refuse searches, weaponizing consent, turning constitutional rights into evidence of guilt, suggesting that asserting your Fourth Amendment protections is somehow admission of criminality." By now, neighbors had started to notice. Porch lights flickering on, curtains pulling back, faces appearing in windows, and you could see the calculation happening in real time. Some recognizing Malcolm, some not. Some concerned about police overreach. Some assuming guilt, because that's what we're trained to assume when we see a black man being questioned by police. The presumption of innocence evaporating in the presence of melanin and badges. Officer Torres, the partner who'd been hanging back, finally approached, and you could see something different in his body language. Something less aggressive. Maybe doubt. Maybe recognition that this stop wasn't sitting right. And he said quietly to Hutchins, "Derek, maybe we should just run his license and let him go. He's cooperating. He lives here." But Hutchins shot him a look that said, "Stay out of this." That said, "I'm in charge." That said, "We're not backing down now regardless of facts or reason or basic human decency." Malcolm pulled out his phone to record the interaction. That modern reflex of self-defense, documentation as protection, and Officer Hutchins immediately escalated. "Put that phone away right now. You're interfering with the police investigation. I can arrest you for obstruction." Which wasn't true, which wasn't legal, which was another threat designed to intimidate, to silence, to prevent the exact accountability that recording provides. But Malcolm held firm, keeping the phone at chest level. Camera pointed forward, and said with controlled precision, "Officer, I have the right to record this interaction. This is established law, and I'm doing nothing to interfere with your investigation beyond documenting it." The standoff was palpable now, tension thick enough to cut. And then Officer Hutchins made a decision that would change everything. He reached for Malcolm's phone, attempting to grab it, to confiscate it, to eliminate the evidence of his own misconduct, and Malcolm reflexively, instinctively pulled back. Not aggressively, not violently, just a natural human response to someone reaching for your property. But in the split second of that movement, Officer Hutchins saw what he wanted to see. Or maybe what he'd been looking for all along. Resistance. Justification, permission to escalate. "He's resisting. He's going for my weapon," Officer Hutchins shouted, lying in real time, creating a narrative that didn't match reality but would match the report. And suddenly Malcolm was being thrown against his own car, arms wrenched behind his back, metal handcuffs biting into his wrists. His face pressed against the cool metal of the Mercedes while Officer Hutchins recited the arrest litany. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, and assaulting a police officer." Charges built on fiction, constructed from bias, weaponizing the legal system against the very person it's supposed to protect. The neighbors were fully engaged now, some recording on phones, some calling out that this was wrong, that Malcolm was their neighbor, that he'd done nothing. And one voice cut through the chaos, Catherine Wells, a white woman in her 60s who lived 2 doors down, marching toward the scene in her bathrobe, calling out with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "Officer, what are you doing? That's Malcolm Rivers. He lives here. He's on our neighborhood council. This is ridiculous." But her intervention, while well-meaning, carried a privilege Malcolm didn't have, because she could approach police with righteous anger without fearing for her life, could demand explanations without being perceived as threatening, could be an ally because the color of her skin bought her the benefit of doubt that Malcolm's accomplishments couldn't purchase. Officer Torres looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting his weight, avoiding eye contact, and you could see the internal struggle, the conflict between loyalty to his partner and recognition that this had crossed a line, that this was wrong, that he was witnessing something that contradicted every principle of justice he'd presumably sworn to uphold. But he stayed silent, complicit through inaction, proving that good cops who do nothing are just cops. That silence in the face of injustice makes you part of the injustice regardless of personal feelings or private doubts. Malcolm, handcuffed against his own car in his own neighborhood for the crime of driving while black, for the audacity of exercising his rights, for the unforgivable sin of not performing sufficient deference to authority, even when that authority was abusing its power, made one statement that would echo through the rest of this story. "Officer Hutchins, badge number 2847, I want your supervisor here immediately. I'm invoking my right to remain silent, and you should know that my attorney is Daniel Chen from Morrison & Associates, and your department is about to face a lawsuit that will make headlines." The mention of a high-powered attorney seemed to register, a flicker of concern crossing Hutchins's face, but he'd committed now, had gone too far to back down, had constructed a narrative that reversing course would expose as fabrication, so he doubled down, loading Malcolm into the back of the patrol car. Reading him rights he already knew, treating a CEO like a criminal because in his eyes, in his worldview shaped by bias and bigotry, successful black men were anomalies requiring investigation rather than individuals deserving respect. As the patrol car pulled away from Oak Boulevard, Malcolm's phone was still recording in his pocket. Catherine Wells was already calling her lawyer husband. Officer Torres was questioning every choice that brought him to this moment, and across town, Police Chief Ronald Martinez was about to receive a phone call that would end his dinner, ruin his evening, and force his department to confront something it had been avoiding for years: accountability. At the precinct, Malcolm was processed with the mechanical efficiency of bureaucracy turned against humanity. Fingerprints, photographs, personal property confiscated, placed in a holding cell while Officer Hutchins filed his report, a document that would paint Malcolm as aggressive, threatening, non-compliant, checking all the boxes that justify force, that transform victim into villain, that protect officers while prosecuting citizens. But here's what Officer Hutchins didn't know, couldn't have anticipated, because he was too busy seeing a black man in an expensive car as suspicious rather than successful. Malcolm Rivers wasn't just any CEO. He was the CEO whose company had just been awarded a $15 million contract to upgrade the city's entire digital infrastructure, a contract negotiated personally with the mayor, announced at a press conference 2 weeks earlier, covered extensively in local media, and yes, that contract included technology upgrades for the police department itself. Body cameras, digital reporting systems, database modernization, all dependent on Rivers Tech Solutions, all dependent on Malcolm Rivers. While Malcolm sat in holding, his attorney Daniel Chen was already in motion. Having received an automated alert from Malcolm's phone's emergency contact system, and Daniel, a Chinese-American lawyer with a reputation for destroying police departments in civil rights cases, made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, first to the duty sergeant demanding his client's immediate release, second to a judge who owed him a favor about an emergency hearing, and third, the most important call, to Police Chief Ronald Martinez's personal cell phone, interrupting his dinner with a message that began, "Chief, one of your officers just arrested Malcolm Rivers, and unless you want to explain to the mayor why you just jeopardized a $15 million city contract and created a PR nightmare that will make your department a national story, I suggest you get down to your station immediately." Chief Martinez, a Latino man in his late 50s who'd spent 30 years working his way up through the ranks, who'd seen too many of these situations explode, who understood that the old ways of circling wagons and protecting officers at all costs no longer worked in the age of cell phone videos and social media, felt his stomach drop because he knew the name Malcolm Rivers, knew about the city contract, knew instantly that whatever happened tonight had the potential to be catastrophic, not just for the department, but for his own career, his legacy, his attempts to reform a department still struggling with racial bias despite years of diversity training and policy reforms. The chief arrived at the precinct 40 minutes later, walked directly past the desk sergeant, straight to the holding cells. And when he saw Malcolm Rivers sitting there in a $3,000 suit with handcuff marks on his wrists, he knew with absolute certainty that this was going to be bad. Potentially career-ending bad, definitely lawsuit bad, definitely viral video bad, definitely national news bad. "Mr. Rivers," Chief Martinez said, standing outside the cell, his voice carrying a mix of professional courtesy and personal concern that Malcolm immediately recognized as damage control. "I apologize for this situation. I'm reviewing the circumstances of your arrest, and I need to understand exactly what happened tonight." Malcolm looked at him with exhausted eyes, with the weariness that comes from being profiled, arrested, and humiliated for no reason beyond the color of his skin, and he responded with measured precision. "Chief, what happened is what happens to black men in this country every day. I was pulled over for driving a nice car in my own neighborhood. I was accused of being suspicious for existing in a space someone decided I didn't belong. I exercised my constitutional rights and was arrested for it. And now you're here because I'm not just any black man. I'm a black man with resources, with attorneys, with contracts your city needs. And that's the only reason you care, not because what happened was wrong, but because what happened was expensive. The chief had no response that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. An admission that Malcolm was right, that justice in America comes tiered by economic class and social connection, that the same arrest happening to a black man without Malcolm's resources would have resulted in a night in jail, a court date, maybe charges that would follow him for life. But Malcolm's CEO status, his city contracts, his powerful attorney, these things bought him consideration that should have been his by right of citizenship, but instead had to be purchased with success and threatened litigation. Chief Martinez made a decision that would define his tenure. He ordered Malcolm's immediate release, personally apologized, promised a full investigation, and then did something that few police chiefs do. He asked Malcolm to stay, to come to his office, to talk not as CEO and chief, but as two men of color trying to navigate a system neither of them had created, but both had to operate within. And Malcolm, against his better judgment, against his attorney's whispered advice to leave immediately and let the lawyers handle everything, agreed because he understood something that anger alone wouldn't solve, that lawsuits alone wouldn't fix, that viral videos alone wouldn't change. Systemic racism requires systemic solutions, requires people in power willing to use that power for change rather than protection of status quo. In the chief's office, Malcolm laid out exactly what happened, showed the phone recording that captured everything, and Chief Martinez watched the video with an expression that shifted from concern to anger to something that looked like shame. Because there it was, undeniable documented evidence of racial profiling, illegal search attempts, false arrest, officer misconduct, everything the department's policies explicitly prohibited but clearly failed to prevent in practice. Officer Hutchins has had 3 previous complaints for racial profiling, Chief Martinez admitted, pulling up internal records, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge that comes too late. Complaints that were investigated and deemed unfounded because there wasn't video evidence, because it was his word against the complainants, because the system protects officers even when it shouldn't. And I take responsibility for that failure, for allowing a pattern to continue until it hits someone with the resources to fight back. But, Mr. Rivers, I need you to know this ends tonight. Officer Hutchins will be suspended immediately pending a full investigation, and depending on what that investigation confirms, and we both know what it will confirm, he'll be terminated, charged if appropriate, and your case will be referred to the FBI for potential civil rights violations. Malcolm listened, processing this promise of accountability, this offer of justice, but he also understood the larger truth. Chief, I appreciate your response, but my concern isn't just about Officer Hutchins. It's about the culture that enabled him, the training that failed to prevent this, the supervision that missed or ignored 3 previous complaints, the system that treats black men as suspects first and citizens second. And if I walk away from this with just 1 officer fired and a settlement check, nothing changes. The next Malcolm Rivers who doesn't have my resources still gets arrested, still gets humiliated, still gets no justice. So here's what I'm proposing. Real reform. Comprehensive reform, the kind that hurts, that costs money, that requires admitting systemic failures and committing to systemic solutions. Or I take this video to every news outlet in the country, I withdraw from the city contract, and I make your department a case study in how not to police diverse communities. The negotiation that followed wasn't typical, wasn't standard procedure, wasn't how these situations usually resolve, because Malcolm wasn't interested in being bought off, wasn't satisfied with personal vindication. He wanted institutional change, wanted reforms that would protect the next person, the next victim, the next black driver who wouldn't have CEO resources or powerful attorneys to defend them. Chief Martinez, to his credit, didn't dismiss this, didn't deflect to committees or studies or the slow death of bureaucratic process. He engaged, he listened, and together they drafted what would become known as the Rivers Protocol, mandatory body cameras that couldn't be turned off during traffic stops, immediate supervisor notification for any arrest of community members in their own neighborhoods, quarterly bias audits of traffic stop data disaggregated by race, community oversight panels with real power beyond advisory capacity, and officer discipline standards that actually enforced consequences for racial profiling rather than just documenting complaints and moving on. But accountability for Officer Hutchins came swiftly and publicly. Chief Martinez held a press conference the next morning, something virtually unheard of in police departments that typically wait for investigations to conclude, for stories to fade, for public attention to move on, and he announced that Officer Derek Hutchins had been suspended without pay, that the arrest of Malcolm Rivers had been expunged from all records, that the department was implementing immediate reforms, and yes, that he personally apologized to Mr. Rivers and to every person of color who'd experienced similar treatment from his department. An apology that acknowledged systemic failure rather than dismissing this as an isolated incident or a few bad apples in an otherwise healthy orchard. The press conference made national news, not because police misconduct is rare, it isn't, but because police accountability and honest institutional admission of systemic racism are rare. Because chiefs who take responsibility rather than defending the indefensible are rare. Because moments when power actually checks itself rather than protecting itself are rare enough to be noteworthy, newsworthy, significant. Officer Torres, the partner who'd stood silent during Malcolm's arrest, came forward voluntarily with a statement that contradicted Officer Hutchins' report, confirming that Malcolm had not resisted, had not reached for anything, had done nothing to justify the escalation or the false charges, and this act of conscience, while belated, while insufficient to undo the harm, represented something important. An officer choosing truth over the blue wall of silence, choosing integrity over loyalty to misconduct, choosing to be part of the solution rather than complicit in the problem. The community response was divided. Predictably so, with some praising the swift action, some skeptical that real change would follow the press conference promises, and some, particularly in online comments and conservative media, suggesting that Malcolm was playing the race card, that he was overreacting, that Officer Hutchins was just doing his job, that if Malcolm had been more compliant, none of this would have happened. All the victim blaming, all the deflection, all the refusal to acknowledge that breathing while black, driving while black, succeeding while black shouldn't require perfect compliance to avoid false arrest and potential violence. Malcolm's own response came in the form of an op-ed published in the local paper, then picked up nationally, titled "The Price of My Freedom," where he wrote with devastating clarity, "I was released not because I was innocent. Innocence is assumed for some and must be proven by others. I was released because I was valuable, because my arrest threatened city contracts and political relationships, because my attorney's call to the police chief carried weight that my rights apparently didn't. And while I'm grateful for the outcome, I'm haunted by the question, what happens to the Malcolm Rivers who isn't a CEO? What happens to the young black man pulled over in the same circumstances, who doesn't have Daniel Chen's number, who doesn't have city contracts as leverage, who doesn't have the resources to fight back? He spends the night in jail. He gets a criminal record. He loses opportunities. He learns that the system isn't designed to protect him, and America loses another person who might have contributed, might have succeeded, might have been valuable if we'd bothered to see their value before we saw their threat. Officer Derek Hutchins was ultimately fired and charged with false arrest, filing a false police report and violation of civil rights, facing potential jail time and permanent loss of his law enforcement certification, and the investigation revealed not just 3 previous complaints, but a pattern documented in traffic stop data showing he was 4 times more likely to pull over black drivers than his peers, 4 times more likely to conduct searches, 4 times more likely to use force. Statistics that had been available but ignored, red flags that had been visible but dismissed, evidence of bias that required someone with Malcolm's resources to force the department to finally acknowledge and act upon. The Rivers Protocol was implemented over 6 months, not without resistance from the police union, not without complaints about increased oversight and accountability, as if accountability was somehow an unfair burden for law enforcement. But Chief Martinez held firm, understanding that his legacy would be defined by this moment, by whether he chose reform or resistance, transparency or tradition, and he chose reform, chose transparency, chose to lead his department into uncomfortable change rather than comfortable stagnation. Malcolm Rivers continued his work with the city, the technology contract proceeding after guarantees that the Rivers Protocol would be fully funded and implemented, but he also became something he never intended to be: an advocate, a voice, a symbol of resistance against racial profiling, speaking at community forums, consulting with other police departments, using his platform not just for business success but for social change, because privilege without purpose is just wealth. Success without responsibility is just comfort. And he understood that his CEO status bought him a megaphone that others didn't have, a responsibility to amplify voices that were systematically silenced. Catherine Wells, the neighbor who'd intervened, became an unexpected ally in the broader reform effort, using her privilege, her whiteness, her social standing, her connections, to advocate for changes that benefited people who didn't look like her, demonstrating that allyship isn't just about individual moments of intervention, but sustained commitment to systemic change, to showing up, to speaking up, to leveraging privilege for justice, rather than just benefiting from it in silence. But here's the hard truth that this story can't escape: the reality that even this relatively positive outcome can't obscure. Malcolm Rivers was lucky. Lucky to have resources, lucky to have documentation, lucky to have a chief willing to act. Lucky to survive an encounter that could have gone so differently, so tragically, so fatally, and luck shouldn't be the determining factor in whether you survive an encounter with law enforcement. Luck shouldn't be required for justice. Luck shouldn't separate the Malcolm Rivers who goes home from the Philando Castile who doesn't, the Sandra Bland who doesn't, the Breonna Taylor who doesn't, the countless names we know and the countless more we don't because their stories didn't have video. Didn't have powerful attorneys, didn't have chiefs willing to act, didn't have resources to fight systems designed to grind them down and move on without accountability. This story, like all stories of racism in America, doesn't have a neat ending, doesn't resolve completely, doesn't offer the satisfaction of problems solved and justice permanently achieved. Because Officer Hutchins was one officer in one department in one city, because the Rivers Protocol helps one community but thousands of others continue with old policies and old biases. Because Malcolm Rivers got justice, but millions of people of color continue to navigate a justice system that sees them as threats first and citizens second, if at all. So when you see the blue lights in your rearview mirror, when you witness a traffic stop that seems wrong, when you hear stories of racial profiling and wonder if they're exaggerated, remember Malcolm Rivers on Oak Boulevard. Remember that he did everything right, was polite, was compliant, knew his rights, owned his home, succeeded in his career, had committed no violation, and still ended up in handcuffs, still faced false charges, still needed resources beyond what most people have to escape a situation that never should have happened in the first place. This is Axiom USA, bringing you stories that challenge, that confront, that refuse to let injustice hide behind excuses and explanations. If this story resonated, if you've experienced your own blue light moment, if you understand that reform requires pressure and accountability requires attention, hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that racial profiling isn't ancient history or isolated incidents, but ongoing reality. And let's keep documenting these stories. Keep demanding accountability. Keep pushing for the day when justice doesn't require luck, resources, or viral videos, but comes automatically, equally, universally to everyone regardless of the color of their skin. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and remember, change doesn't come from silence, doesn't come from acceptance of the status quo, doesn't come from hoping systems will fix themselves. Change comes from stories told, from incidents documented, from people like Malcolm Rivers who use their platforms for more than personal success, who leverage their survival into advocacy for others, who understand that individual justice without systemic change is just a temporary reprieve in an ongoing battle that won't be won in one traffic stop, one lawsuit, one reform protocol, but through sustained pressure, constant vigilance, and refusal to let any community member face injustice alone. This is Axiom USA, and we're not done telling these stories until we don't have to anymore, until the blue lights in the rearview mirror carry the same meaning for everyone, until suspicious becomes a description of behavior rather than appearance, until justice is a right rather than a privilege purchased with resources and documented with video, until America lives up to its promises for all its citizens, not just those with the luck, resources, and survival skills to demand it.